When people think of Putin, they think of power. Vladimir Putin has been ruling Russia since 1999. There hasn't been such a powerful leader in Russia since Stalin. He invaded neighboring countries, interfered in US election, and even changed the constitution to stay in power until 2036. But that hasn't always been the case. Back in the 1990s, Russia was ruled by the oligarchs, a group of people who amassed massive fortune during the collapse of the Soviet Union. They controlled the media, had most of the politicians on their payroll, and even brought Putin to power. But when Putin refused to return the favor, the oligarchs waged a war against him. The Soviet Union sent the first man to space, developed the first ever satellite, and was the second largest economy. But by the 1980s, the Union began to weaken, especially after the war in Afghanistan. The war drained the Soviet budget and sent it into a recession. The Soviet leadership tried everything to modernize the economy, but it was too late already. People began to protest, asking for independence. When the Berlin Wall fell, countries began breaking out of the Soviet Union one by one. The Soviet economy was huge but deeply ineffective. Despite its massive size, ownership was illegal. Everything belonged to the state, and the state belonged to people. At least that's how the Communist Party wanted you to think. The country was filled with factories that produced everything from steel to tanks to aluminium, but it was deeply centralized. At the end of the year, whatever profits the factories made, they had to send it back to Moscow, and Moscow would redistribute the funds back to the factories based on their needs. So if the factories spent $800,000 instead of $1 million that they had received, the Kremlin would cut their budget next year to $800,000, since it will assume that that's how much they need. That's why factory managers would always overspend in order to receive more funds next year. That led to the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of ineffective factories all across the country, which pushed the country into a lot of debt and a recession, which eventually led to the collapse of the Union. Russia had to move from communism into socialism overnight. The Russian government knew that they had to privatize all of the factories across the country, since they were a huge burden on the government's budget. But at the same time, it wanted the average Russians to benefit from this transition. 1/3 of the companies will be owned by the people, the second third will be owned by the government, and the last third will be sold to investors. So it redistributed the so-called vouchers that the average Russians could exchange for shares in these companies. It sounded great in theory, but it could easily be abused in practice. For most Russians, the concept of ownership was something unheard of. They did not really know how it could benefit them, so they sold the vouchers to factory managers for a fraction of a price, especially when most Russians back then hadn't received their wages for months and needed cash to put food on the table. Instead of the average people benefiting out of this transition, a few individuals took advantage out of the system and became Russia's new elite. But the concept of oligarchs became popular a bit later, when Russia's first president ran for a re-election in 1996. Boris Yeltsin's popularity was falling quickly since the country was in chaos, and many blamed the president for mismanaging the crisis. Everyone knew that he would lose the election, especially when the parliament was mainly controlled by the communists, who were confident that they would take over the presidency in the next election. So, Boris Yeltsin turned to the country's richest bankers for help, but the oligarchs weren't ready to risk their fortunes for nothing. They wanted something in return, a bigger pie of the economy. But to sell the rest of the companies that were owned by the government, the parliament had to approve it, and it was pretty impossible since it was mostly controlled by the communists. So they became creative and came up with a brilliant strategy and robbed the entire Russian government. You see, Russia's financial system back then was still immature, so the government funds were deposited in commercial banks and mostly managed by them. Since the country was in chaos and Yeltsin desperately wanted to be re-elected, Russia's top bankers offered him a deal. The oligarchs will lend him $500 million with an annual interest rate of 150% and will take the government shares in the biggest companies as a collateral. If the government would not be able to pay back its loans, the banks would be able to keep these shares. Eventually, Boris Yeltsin won the election in 1996, but the government, as expected, wasn't able to pay back the debt. That's how a few individuals literally became the owners of Russia's largest companies. Vladimir Putin, who was the mastermind behind this scheme, received the controlling stake in Norilsk Nickel, one of the world's largest nickel and palladium mining and smelting companies. It cost him $170 million, but today the company is worth almost $50 billion, and Putin's net worth is $27 billion, making him the second wealthiest man in Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky received a 45% majority stake in Yukos, Russia's largest oil and gas company back then, for an estimated $159 million, which by 2003 was worth dozens of billions of dollars, making Khodorkovsky Russia's richest man with an estimated net worth of $17 billion. But the most notable example is Berezovsky. First, he took control over Avtovaz, Russia's largest automobile manufacturer. Then he sneaked into Aeroflot, Russia's largest airline, and somehow managed to control it. And finally, in 1996, through this scheme, he received Sibneft, together with Abramovich, the second largest oil company, which today is known as Gazprom. In a matter of a year, 7 people accumulated so much fortune that they started buying politicians, TV stations, and tried to take full control of the government. When Yeltsin wanted to resign, Berezovsky convinced him to make this young KGB officer named Putin as his successor. Putin acted like a perfect puppet. He guaranteed Yeltsin and his family the security he wanted, and the oligarchs the favor they asked for. But something went wrong. Putin kept his promise to Yeltsin, but he began to consolidate power when he sat on the throne. Now that he is the one who is wearing the crown, the rules of the game have changed. It was the time to show the oligarchs who is the real Tsar. But the oligarchs weren't ready to simply give up power. They controlled the media, they had billions of dollars and multiple politicians on their payroll. They wanted to let Putin know that it's them who put him on the throne, and they can take it away if he's not going to return the favor. Gusinski was one of the oligarchs who controlled NTV, the biggest TV channel in Russia back then, the newspaper Sigotnya, and the radio station Echo of Moscow, and a number of magazines. He was the man who controlled public opinion in Russia. Everyone knew that he was not someone to mess with. His media empire aggressively began attacking Putin and mocking him. His popularity began to decline as the media kept spreading bad news about him. Putin knew that if he wanted to rule Russia with an iron grip, he must first control the press. He launched an investigation against Gusinski with the goal of putting NTV under the government's control and effectively silencing the opposition. Gusinski was charged with misappropriation of funds and large-scale fraud and was arrested. Shortly after his arrest, representative of the Kremlin proposed to Gusinski to sell Mediamost, his media empire worth a few $billions at least, to Gazprom Media at a price that Gazprom Media sets, which was $300 million, in return for his freedom. Under immense pressure, Gusinski signed the deal and immediately left Russia after being released. But Putin did not stop there. He wanted to make Gusinski an example for other oligarchs. Shortly after he left Russia, he launched a new investigation against Gusinski and asked Interpol's head office in France to issue an international arrest warrant for Gusinski's detention and extradition. Fortunately for him, Interpol's head office declined the Russian request, but the Russian government kept pressuring until the Spanish government arrested him and placed him under house arrest in Gusinski's house in southern Spain. Other oligarchs quickly took note and decided not to mess with the new king and change sides. Abramovich, Potanin, Deripaska, Friedman all surrendered to Putin in exchange for keeping their fortunes and, most importantly, freedoms. But not Berezovsky, the main person who was behind Putin's presidency. He controlled the second largest TV channel in the country. He was expecting huge favors from Putin since he was the main person who made him the president. But in return, the government launched an investigation into his business deals with Aeroflot. Then the government literally took over his media empire. He was forced to exile in the United Kingdom and lost all of his businesses in Russia. His last hope was to win a court case against Abramovich, his former partner but now Putin's puppet, for $5.5 billion. However, he lost, so his life ended tragically in 2013. Now that Putin took control of the media, no one could challenge his authority, except Russia's richest man back then, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. With a net worth of $17 billion, Khodorkovsky was confident that he can buy anything and make himself the man who would run the country behind closed curtains. In February 2003, at a televised meeting at the Kremlin, Khodorkovsky publicly argued with Putin, accusing government officials of corruption, accepting millions of rubles in bribes. The two men had completely different visions for the country's future, but only one will prevail. In early July 2003, Khodorkovsky's most important partner was arrested. The arrest was followed by an investigation into tax evasion by his oil and gas company, Yukos. On the morning of the 25th of October 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested at Novosibirsk airport. He was taken to Moscow and charged with fraud, tax evasion, and other economic crimes. His company was entirely eliminated and he was imprisoned for the next 10 years. Not a single oligarch ever challenged Putin again. His power grew so much that it became impossible to imagine Russia without Putin. We all know that billionaires can afford to buy anything that they want, from private islands to whiskey companies. So with access to almost anything, I was surprised to learn that rich people value art so much that 2/3 of billionaire collectors allocate between 10 and 30% of their overall portfolio to art. And that's not by accident. This asset class outpaced the S&P 500 by 174% from 1995 to 2020 and has seen almost triple the appreciation of real estate. The total wealth held in art is estimated to be worth $1.7 trillion, and Deloitte projects it to grow $900 billion by 2026. But art is expensive. They can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That's where today's video sponsor comes into the picture, Masterworks. Masterworks is the first platform that breaks down art and sells them as pieces, just like you invest in shares in the stock market on your favorite trading app. To date, 300,000 people have signed up and they're looking to grow next year. In fact, one of their latest offerings by famous street artist Banksy sold out in under 3 hours. If you want to take advantage and invest in some fine art, there is a waitlist. But you can skip the waitlist and immediately start investing by clicking my link in the description, and it also really supports the channel. So go and check it out.